For my Chapter 1 movement, I chose the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a movement during the 1740s. Causes of this movement were from the Enlightenment stage of U.S. history, which was where the colonists wanted a religion with not as much strong feelings as some of the other religions. There had been concerns from that movement, so the Great Awakening began. This caused colonists to put more attention toward an individual's spiritual relationship. It led to more churches being built and people deciding to govern themselves. I chose the Great Awakening because it led up to one of the causes of the American Revolution. It also helped to let everyone pick their own religion, which is important to a lot of people. For my historical figure, I chose Thomas Jefferson because of his influence on the early development of America. He helped form a better country for us and made the Declaration of Independence for our freedom. Jefferson was also the governor of Virginia and was a part of the Virginia legislature. In 1800, he was elected president and served 2 terms in office. Before his presidential election, he was the vice president of John Adams. Jefferson also helped America by doubling our size and buying the Louisiana Purchase. For my Chapter 2 historical figure, I chose Andrew Jackson. I selected him because of his many helping changes in America. He increased voting rights and campaigning, which was in the helping of letting every legal American vote. During his presidency, Jackson helped to make any white man able to vote. He increased it to 80% of the 30% before in the first half of the 1800s. Even though natives and women couldn't vote yet, it still led up to them being able to. Jackson also didn't like Native Americans and wanted the land they were on. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830 and he made the Cherokee Indians walk all the way to Indian Territory, which killed about 4,000 of the 15,000. My movement for this chapter is the Trail of Tears. In the northwestern parts of Georgia, there was gold found where the Cherokee Indians were settled. White settlers had found this out in 1829, and the government had decided to remove the Indians from their own territory. Not only did the Cherokee have to be removed, but other Native American tribes as well. None of them were allowed to make a stand in this situation, so more than 15,000 Indians were forced to relocate in Indian Territory. About 1,000 miles from where they were originally located, they ended up west. The path these Indians took was then called the Trail of Tears. More than 4,000 of the 15,000 died on their way. I chose this event because it was huge on leading up to America now. They were forced to move off their own land, which isn't right. If it's their land, they should be able to keep it. For Chapter 3, my historical figure I chose was Robert E. Lee. I chose him because of his great leadership in the Civil War and sticking with his hometown and fight instead of betraying them. Lee was the commanding officer of the Confederate Army of the South in the Civil War. Lee was asked by Lincoln to be in charge of the entire Union Army on his side, but he turned them down to follow his own state when Virginia fell from the Union. Ulysses Grant was then the leader of the Union and took Lee's army down, but Robert E. Lee was the greater of the 2 leaders. For my movement for Chapter 3, I picked the Gettysburg Address. On the site of the bloodiest ground from the Civil War, President Lincoln was asked to speak on the cemetery where the people who fought in the Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for the Civil War had been buried. This speech, spoken in 1863, was then called the Gettysburg Address. This speech he made would be known from then on as one of the most important speeches that America has had. In his speech, it said many things on equality and were stated in the Declaration of Independence. It also had the Civil War and desire of a new birth of freedom compared in the Gettysburg Address. I chose this as main event because of its significance. It was in the helping of people realizing to treat people equally. Some people today still don't realize that it is important in our world, but many events like the Gettysburg Address are still helping. The Gettysburg Address was another event to help with the progress of this. For my Chapter 4 figure, I chose Thomas Edison because of his determination. Even though he wasn't that good in school, he showed people different. His differences in life and determination led to many opportunities for himself and to many good things to America today. Also, if he didn't create the light bulb, I wouldn't be as good of a photographer as I am today. Thomas Edison was an inventor. He started inventing at the young age of 16 and came up with many different inventions. With enough money from the inventions he made before, he had the Menlo Park complex built so many people, including himself, could work on inventions too. He also created affordable lighting for homes by creating the light bulb. He also came up with the thought of power plants to connect the light power through cities. My movement I chose for Chapter 4 is the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was an act against trust, which was big business. It was named after Senator John Sherman. Some other states had passed laws that were like this, but it was also limited. This act was made to make everything relating to allowing trust to be illegal. If they violated the act, they would be put in jail for a year and be fined $5,000. This act was supposed to dissolve trust, but Supreme Court prevented it from happening for a couple of years. In 1911, President Taft brought it back to prevent the trusts. I chose this movement because the trusts were a big movement in American history, and if I had an opinion, I would be antitrust too. Some of the trusts could be either good or bad, depending on the businesses you were dealing with. Competition between businesses isn't something that I would want to deal with. Elisha Otis was my historical figure for this chapter. In 1845, he thought up with the idea of an elevator for skyscrapers. No one noticed this at first, but then at the New York World's Fair, his invention of an elevator with an automatic brake was the attention seeker. Many people then started ordering them each year. His elevators are definitely still a big hit all around the world still. He holds the majority of people buying elevators from his company. Many of the elevators have been put in some of the most important buildings in the world, such as the Empire State Building and Eiffel Tower. I chose him because elevators have helped so many people. Walking up to the top of skyscrapers would be a pain, and I'm glad we don't have to do that. It also helps disabled people get to the top of them too. For the next chapter, I picked the Gilded Age. This was where many wealthy products were created and people were supported by these things. It also created a huge flow of money for Rockefeller's oil and Carnegie's steel. Both of these guys were called robber barons from getting rich in this period of guild. They got rich from this period because of steel and oil being in high demand. Mark Twain then came up with the name of Gilded Age because of so much wealth and industries. I chose the Gilded Age because of its significance of today. A lot of us Americans rely on wealthy products that industries make. There are also more robber barons in the 20th century like Rockefeller and Carnegie. For this chapter, I picked the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act happened because Congress wanted the land to be given care of and to receive more crops. U.S. citizens who qualified were allowed 160 acres of land for $1.25 per acre. This was known as the Homestead Act. They started making these land grants for small farmers. The Homestead Bill was passed in 1858, but the Republicans didn't approve until 1860. The Homestead Act of 1862 was then when land was granted to American citizens. I chose the Homestead Act because it showed how much land meant to people. Some men would leave their wives and kids to go buy some land all the way across America because it was so great. It also helped the grade of crops go up by small business farmers so that they could get paid more for their hard work. Sitting Bull was my historical figure for this chapter. Sitting Bull was the Indian chief of the Sioux tribe. The Sioux tribe had found gold back in the Black Hills in 1874, which brought them to encounter with some U.S. authorities. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse then came together with their tribes to attack on federal troops, including George Custer. Those tribes had been fighting against them and attacking at random times for many years. Starvation was an impact on the Sioux tribe, so he finally surrendered. Him and his people were then forced to live on reservation. Sitting Bull was killed in 1890 by U.S. agents because of the fear of him leading on the ghost dance. I chose Sitting Bull because of his great courage. Sitting Bull never gave up, only to feed his people, which showed he cared about them a lot. He was stubborn in his determination, but that's what made him such a great leader in his tribe. For my Chapter 7 movement, I chose the Populist Party. This was known as the People's Party and began in 1892. James B. Weaver was elected president of the Populist Party. This party spread around the U.S. so fast that it made both of the biggest political parties consider their demands. The Populists fought for low prices, free silver, and to fight against the high prices, they had demanded ownership of railroads. They were also convinced that them and urban workers had the same rival, known as the industrial elite. I chose the Populist Party because of the people who formed a group to fight for their fair rights is something I would join and that I would look up to. I wouldn't like the government deciding that I need to pay more than what I need for something or forcing less pay for me. I'm glad that some people decided to create the group to help themselves as well as the other people around them. For my figure in Chapter 7, I picked Oliver H. Kelly. He was a man who was interested in the farmers' organizations and agriculture. He wanted to see farmers make progress in the U.S. and to be great producers. In 1867, Kelly and some of his associates from the U.S. Bureau of Agriculture founded the Grange. The Grange was a social organization to fix prices for farmers because they were unfair. He had written newspapers that were incredibly critical about farming needs and freight rates. His influence on helping the farmers spread fast, which increased Grange memberships across the U.S. I chose Oliver Kelly because of his determination to help out people in need. He helped farmers to be able to afford what they needed to sell their products and produce them. He settled the unfair prices to affordable prices so farmers could also do what they needed. Doing this also influenced our farmers today by helping our prices stay at a stable rate. For Chapter 8, I picked Booker T. Washington. Washington was a man who educated blacks. In that period of time, Washington was also an institution builder. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. This school was focused mostly on industrial education and educating public school teachers. Along with the institute, he created newspapers, schools, and the National Business League. Booker T. Washington was also a very powerful speaker and the writer of Up from Slavery in 1901. I chose him because of his helpfulness of race. Most of the blacks back in those days weren't really allowed to do anything and were discriminated, so he made a school for blacks only, which is incredible. He stood up for what he believed in, and people like that are amazing in so many different ways. For my last movement, I selected the Niagara Movement. This was made up of 32 people, including John Hope and W.E.B. Du Bois. All of these people met up secretly to demand full manhood suffrage. They invited many other black African Americans to join them in New York for a meeting about it. In between the dates of July 11th and 14th, 1905, 29 of those men got together and met up at Niagara Falls, which they then called the Niagara Movement. This group was made up of 170 members, and they didn't have much money, but they just kept protesting against Jim Crow laws and continuing their activities until it was right. Jim Crow laws were about segregation and not treating African Americans equally. I selected this topic because it shows how many people went through ridiculously out of their way to treat other people who were normal unequally. African Americans had to fight forever to get their equal rights, and many people today still don't have equal rights. It just shows one of the beginnings of discrimination and segregation to me. Equal rights are very important, and no matter who you are.